All right. So welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce Vincent Deval, also from INRIA, and he'll be telling us part 2 about an optimal transport perspective on the persistence diagram space. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for the introduction. And also thanks to the organizers for the invitation. So this talk is just going to be the natural continuations of Theo's talk on the optimal transport perspective on the persistent diagram space. And I will really focus on more statistical applications on this formalism. So basically there will be 2 parts. First, I'm going to talk about vectorizations of persistent diagrams, and then at the end of the talk, I will talk about the expected persistent diagram again and their statistical properties. Okay, so first, what are those vectorizations of persistent diagrams? The idea is always the same. You have the standard TDA pipeline where you assume that you observe n ID objects, x1, xn. So those objects, it can be, for instance, graphs or point clouds or molecules, 3D shapes, really anything which has some underlying topology. And you want to understand some aspect of the topology which underlies those objects. So to do so, you build a filtration on top of the objects, and then you get persistent diagrams, so mu1 up to mu_n, which are elements of DP, so the space of persistent diagram. And here there is a remark which has been made by the TDA community. It is that, the space of persistent diagrams is only a metric space, and it's not a vector space. And this is actually a problem when you want to perform statistical tasks, because most of the techniques that you know, they are for vector spaces. For instance, if you want to, apply deep learning techniques, then you need to have vectors. So, to overcome this issue, there is a very natural idea, which is just to send your persistent diagrams to a Banach space. To do so, you will actually use what we call a vectorization, which is a map phi from the space of diagram to a Banach space. And so you just take any vectorization that you want, and you will get a set of vectors, phi mu1 up to phi mu_n. And now that you have the set of vectors, you can just use them in any machine learning pipeline that you like. So that's the idea. Of course, in this pipeline, you have an obvious choice, which is the choice of the vectorization file. And actually, there are a lot of choices which have been proposed in the literature. So just to be sure that we are all on the same page here about what we mean by vectorizations, I'm going to cite a few of them. So for example, you have Betti curves. So here a Betti curve is just that if you have a diagram, you have different scales. And at each scale, you look at the corresponding Betti numbers of the underlying object and it gives you a number. And now if you move the scale, it gives you a curve. And so these are, you can see this as vectorizations of the diagram, which arise, for instance, in the space of LP functions from R to R, which is a Banach space. Also, you can have persistent silhouettes, which are based on persistent landscapes. And maybe also persistent surface, where here the idea is that you, for each point in the diagram, you can replace this point by a small, for instance, Gaussian bump. And now if you look at the set of all the Gaussian bumps, then you will observe what you can call a surface. And this is really nice actually, because a surface, if you discretize it, you have an image. And machine learning is very good for treating images. So this idea was introduced by a paper by Henry Adams and co-authors, but actually also by a lot of different papers at more or less the same time. And it can work very well in practice. So these are a few examples, but there are a lot of them also, like persistent landscapes. You can also use tropical coordinates or even kernel methods like Slice-Wasserstein kernel. So there are really a lot of vectorizations possible. But what we can do is try to classify them into different categories. And actually there is a subcategory which is particularly nice. It is a set of linear vectorization. So what we're going to call a linear vectorization is a map phi from the space of diagram to B, a Banach space, which has a very special form. The idea is that you will have an underlying map F from omega. So I recall that omega is the ground space, let's say the upper half plane, to some banner space B. And then you will build the vectorization phi by saying that phi of mu is equal to mu of f. So mu of f is, by definition, the integral of f against mu that you see as a measure. So recall that mu is just a sum of Dirac. So this is actually equal to the sum over x, the points of the diagrams, of f of x. So this is really simple. And so what we're able to do, thanks to the characterization of convergence that Theo talked about in the first part, is to exactly characterize the set of linear vectorizations which are continuous. That's to say, you have the following theorem, which tells you that a linear vectorization phi is continuous if and only if f, the underlying map, belongs to this functional space. So this functional space is a space of functions which are of the form distance to the power p to the diagonal times g, where g is continuous and bounded. So the idea is that you need to have a function which is continuous and which goes to 0 sufficiently fast when you go to the diagonal. So actually this theorem asserts two different things. First, that if you take f in this space, then you will have a linear vectorization which is continuous. And then that it is the only way to have a continuous linear vectorization. So now I will only prove one half of the theorem. That's to say, if f belongs to the space, then phi is continuous. So let's do this. And actually, the proof is really only an utilization of the convergence theorem that Theo talked about in the first part. So to see this, we need to first simple remark, which consists in introducing, if mu is a persistent diagram, mu p, which is going to be a finite measure on the ground space, and that we define as follows. We say that mu p of A is going to be the integral over A of the distance to the diagonal to the power p that you integrate against mu, that you see as a measure. So recall that mu may have an infinite number of points. So mu may not be a finite measure, but mu p is always a finite measure. Why? Because the total mass of mu p, that's to say mu p of omega, is going to be the integral of omega over omega of this quantity, and is exactly equal to the total persistence of the diagram. And by assumption, we say that our diagrams have finite total persistence. So this guy mu p is a finite measure. Okay, that was a preliminary remark. Now, we want to show that phi is continuous. How do you do this? You just take a sequence mu_n, which converges to mu, and you want to show convergence of the corresponding representations, or vectorizations. So we have a nice theorem which tells you what converging means. So let's use it. It actually tells you that you have vague convergence of the measure mu_n. That's to say mu_n converges vaguely to mu, and convergence of the total persistence. That's the theorem from the previous talk. Now we have introduced the measure mu p. So let us see what this means on the measure mu p. Well, so this is a very simple exercise to see that having vague convergence of mu_n means that you have also vague convergence of mu_np. And having convergence of the total persistences means that you have convergence of the total masses of mu_np with our previous remark. So now actually this is very nice because we have a basic theorem from measure theory which tells you that having vague convergence and convergence in the total masses means that you have weak convergence. So that's the line below. So what does weak convergence means? Weak convergence means that you have mu_npg which converges to mu_pg for all g which are continuous and bounded. So here I recall that by mu_pg I mean the integral of g against mu_p, which is a measure. Okay, but now actually the proof is over. Because if you look at what mu_npg is, you see that this is equal to mu_n of f, where f is equal to the distance to the diagonal to the power p times g. So what we have actually is a convergence of mu_nf to mu_f, which exactly means that the representation depending on f is continuous. So the proof is over. Okay, so really, once you have the characterization of convergence, all the proof is really easy. So this is a nice theorem. We have a very neat characterization. But of course, if you want this theorem to be interesting, we have to see that linear vectorizations exist and are indeed interesting. So let us see a few examples. First, linear vectorization that you can consider is by taking f, by saying that f of x should be equal to x2 minus x1 to the power p. So if you do so, and if you take a diagram and you sum over points of the diagram this quantity, you will actually get what you call the total persistence. So you can see that this is a linear vectorization, which is continuous. But maybe this is not the most interesting one, as the Banach space here is just R. So of course you lose a lot of information with this mapping. So maybe more interesting, you can look now at the persistent surface, where here you just say that f of x is just going to be, let's say, a Gaussian bump centered at x. So of course now, if you sum the different bump functions with respect to x's, the points in the diagram, you will exactly obtain what we call the persistent surface. And here also remark that we need to weight the kernel function by the distance to the diagonal to the power p for this function to belong to the functional space. So we know now that we need this weighting for the function to be continuous. So of course, this weighting was already done, but here we really see that it is necessary to do so. And last example, the Betti curves. So to recover the Betti curves, what you can do is define a function f of x, which will belong to L1 of R, by saying that f of x at scale t is equal to 1 if x is in Bt and 0 otherwise, where Bt is this world. So when you sum the f of x of t for x points of the diagram, you will actually obtain the number of points of the diagram in this square Bt, which is exactly the Betti number t of the underlying diagram. So you actually recover the Betti curves. And you can see that this will also be a continuous linear vectorization. Okay, so these are some nice examples. So just to end this first part on linear vectorizations, I want to end with a small remark, which is to say, so now you have a set of vectors. As I said before, you can do a lot of complicated things. You can use deep learning, things like this. But just to summarize the set of vectors, maybe the simplest thing you can do is just compute their means. That's to say, you can compute phi bar n, which is the sum of the phi mu I divided by n. And here, when the vectorization is linear, something very neat happens. It is that you will have that the mean of the vectorizations is equal to the vectorization of the mean, which is something that you expect because everything is linear. So here, by vectorization of the mean, I mean this is equal to mu bar n of f, where mu bar n is a sample mean of the set of diagrams that Theo has already introduced. Okay, so this is another motivation for introducing the sample mean of a set of diagrams and the expected percent diagrams. It means that if you want to understand how mean vectorizations behave, you should understand how sample mean of diagrams behave. So this is for the definition of the expected percent diagrams when you have a finite set of diagrams. But more generally, what you can consider is having a probability distribution P on the set of percent diagram dp. And here you can also define the expected percent diagram in this setting. You do as follows. First, you need to assume finiteness of moment assumptions, which is here. So you have to assume that the expected value of the total persistence is finite. And if you do so, you can show that you can define in a unique way a measure, a p mu, that you call the expected percent diagram of p, and that you define by duality, actually. That's to say, you say that by definition, the integral of f against the PD is the expected value of the corresponding representation or vectorization. So that's to say, you want this formula to hold for any f which belongs to the functional space Cp omega r of vectorizations, which are continuous. Okay, so here there is a remark which is really important, and we really want to stress on this, it is that the EPD is not a percent diagram anymore, okay? It is a general radon measure on omega. So now, and this is what we'll do, if you want to analyze different properties of the EPD, we need to generalize the distances between percent diagrams to more general measure, and this is what Theo has presented in the first part of the talk. Okay, so now if we want to do statistics, to perform statistical tasks with the EPD, we need to know some basic statistical properties. And here I think there are really two basic questions. The first one is stability. That's to say, if I change a little bit my low P, how does the EPD change? And of course, we would like it to not change too much. And also, the second question is a question of estimation. That's to say, in practice, we will not have access to P, but more realistically, we will have access to a finite sample, mu1 up to mu_n of low P. And given this sample, how can we have access or try to estimate the EPD? So now we will answer to those two questions. Okay, so for the first one, stability, what we have is the following stability results, which asserts that if you sample points, according to law Xi1 on RZ, so let's say you sample n points, then you can compute the corresponding percent diagram of those endpoints with respect to the change filtration. And you will get a percent diagram, which is random because you sampled endpoints, and those endpoints are also random. So if you have random percent diagram, you can consider its low P1. And now you can sample points with a different low Xi2, and you will get a different low in the space of percent diagram P2. And of course, what you would like to happen is that if the ways with which we sample the points, the two distributions Xi1 and Xi2 are close in some sense, then the corresponding EPD should be close also. So here you have a little illustration of this fact, where in blue we sampled points on two circles, and you see that the EPD looks like this, it's very clean. And the red crosses are also the same observations, but noisy. And here you can compute the EPD. It looks pretty much the same, but you see that you have noise and you have topological noise also here. Okay, so what we're able to do is to show that you have some kind of bottleneck stability results, which tells you that the OT infinity distance between the EPD, so this is the analog of the bottleneck distance, but for general measure on the upper half plane, is controlled by the Wasserstein distance between your two low Xi1 and Xi2. So the Wasserstein distance, I will not detail what it is here. Let's just say it is a very standard matrix between probability solutions. So this is a very nice stability result with a constant 1 here. Basically, we have an application which is 1 Lipschitz. We also have other stability results with P finite, but things get a little bit messier because you have some constants appearing here, so we'll not get into details. But here, what you should think about is that you really have a nice stability result if you sample points and you see that the EPD is a stable object. Okay, that's the first question. Now for the second of estimation. Well, actually, we have a very natural estimator that we have already talked about, which just consists in saying that you have a set of measure sampled according to P mu1 up to mu_n, and you can just perform their linear expectation. That's to say, you say that mu bar n is just the sum of the diagrams that you divide by n. And so there is a natural question: how does this object approximate the expected percent diagram? And so we have the following theorem, which is a minimax result on the estimation of the EPD, and which asserts that if you define PLM as a set of probability measures supported on the set of diagrams with less than n points supported in the square of size L. So what this means is that if P is in PLM and you sample a diagram mu according to P, then this diagram will always have less than n points and be supported on a square of size L. Okay? So if you take such a loop P, then we are able to show that the expected value of the distances to the power P, OTPP, between the sample mean of the diagrams and the true expected percent diagram is controlled by this quantity. which is of the form ml to the power p divided by square root of n. So here what's really important is the rate as n goes to infinity, which is in 1 over square root of n. So this is what we call in statistics a parametric rate of convergence. And this is most of the time the best rate we can have. So here actually, we can show that this is in some sense the best rate by proving a minimax result, which basically tells you that if you consider any estimator, hat mu n, then the uniform risk this estimator will have on the class PLM will be also larger than the same constant, ml to the power p divided by square root of n. So in some sense, mu bar n is the best estimator you can have on the EP. And this answers our second question of the estimation. Okay, so this finishes the talk. So if you have any questions, please ask them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Before we get to questions, let's unmute ourselves briefly, and thanks, Vincent.
Thank you.
All right, questions for our speaker? Michael, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I basically, maybe I asked my first question again in some different form, but what confuses me a bit is what is the relation between the Wasserstein metric on distributions and the metric that you propose? Because you said in the talk that you don't want to explain what the Wasserstein metric is.
Okay.
Is it what you defined as OT? Is this different from the Wasserstein metric on the distributions?
Yeah, okay. So actually, yes, so there are really fundamental differences between the Wasserstein distance between probability distributions and this OT infinity distance. So the fundamental difference is that the Wasserstein distance is the distance between probability metrics. That's to say, it is the distance between measures which have all mass 1. So it is easy to extend it to have a distance between measures which have all the same mass, let's say m. But there is a key difference between Wasserstein distance and those OTP distance. It is the fact that here, the OTP distance, it is a distance between measures which have different masses. And so really, this is something which is not a lot studied by the optimal transport community. It is really a different problem than the standard problem of optimal transport. So this is really the key difference. And here also, we allow measures to have different masses and even to have possibly infinite masses. So this is really the key difference. Of course, there is the same idea of matching and
so a follow-up question for the Wasserstein distance. Oh.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Yeah. So would it be this if the masses are the same, would it be equal to the Wasserstein distance, or would it be a different measure? And if so, is there a relation between the two?
Well, so actually what you can see is that if you take 2 points, let's say you have one diagram with 1 point and one diagram with another point here. Indeed, you can say that these are just 2 probability measures, and you can look at the Wasserstein distance, and this will be actually just mapping 1 point on another. Whereas if you look at the distance OTP, or even if you see them at diagram, of course, what you can do is match them to a diagonal. And here you can have maybe a cost which is smaller. So actually, you can see that it will always have a smaller cost if you look at the OTP distance. But generally, if you have different masses, of course, it doesn't make sense to compare them. But let's say that you allow more matchings with the OTP distances because you have diagonal.
Okay, thank you very much.
And then another question. So the infinite Wasserstein distance on the right-hand side, this W infinity, this is just the limit as P goes to infinity. So in the best matching, this is just the longest distance that any 2 sort of parts of the measure are matched. Is that right?
Yeah, completely. You're right. Yeah, this is exactly this. So actually, in practice, people in the optimal transport community use Wasserstein distances, but very scarcely with P equal infinity. Most of the time, they use P equals 2. But here, of course, if we want to have this nice stability result, as we have an infinity here, we have an infinity here. But if we have P equals 2 here, we will have P equals 2 here.
Further questions?
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
So what about computation? I think if I'm thinking about the first part of the talk, that you mentioned that when you define this OT definition, that there is an inf over sort of also those partial matchings as well, right?
Yes.
How is this sort of manifest itself in practice? For example, obviously in the above example, it seems like you have already computed this. What about computational complexity when you actually want to obtain this OT distance?
Yeah. So here, actually, Theo is much more a specialist than I, but to answer very simply, the idea is that you will more or less put a grid on your on your ground space, and you will say that each cell in the grid has a certain mass. And then, well, this is what people do in a classical optimal transport and to compute distances. They just always put a grid and say that you will have different cells with different mass, and then you just compute the matching problem. Or you can do more refined techniques such as using regularization and things like this if you want to have to speed up the convergence of the computations.
So essentially, in practice, you kind of discretize this measure on your domain, and then you just run it as sort of optimal transport kind of matching.
Yeah,
and
definitely.
Then that complexity will be
but
based
then to compute it, you have to take care, because this is not just computing the Wasserstein distance between those two grids. You have to take into account the diagonal and things like this. But yeah, basically this is an optimal transport problem. So you just use tools from computational optimal transport to compute this quantity, and that's it.
And in a sense that, do you have maybe I missed it in the talk, do you have any sort of notion that depend on my discretization that the result is sort of stable also? That, I could imagine I could discretize it in, 10 by 10 versus 1,000 by 1,000 and so on and so forth.
Yes, so yeah, indeed, you can show, we did not talk about the more computational aspects, but you can have some results about the fact that if you take a grid which is more and more refined, then you will have computations which are more and more precise. But of course, this will take more time. But yeah, we have results like this.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, well, thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. So I was wondering about this theorem of yours and how tight that bound is with the W infinity. I mean, thinking about perhaps other metrics in density manifold or like probability space and the Wasserstein space, like Fisher-Rao metric, or whether have you considered like what other options for that metric on the right-hand side might give you a tight bound, or whether this is already a tight bound, I don't know. Thanks.
So is it tight? Actually, we have not really thought about looking at other metrics, because this metric is very natural in some sense, because you match things to have distances between diagrams and use couplings and things like this and transport plans. So very naturally, you will also have transport plans between the probability distributions that you consider. So for the fact, are there other natural distances for which you have an inequality like this? Actually, I don't know. And yeah, actually, really, I don't know. Maybe you could have other stability results, but this is, I would say, maybe the most natural one that you would obtain if you try to write down a proof.
Well, thanks.
Further questions? Well, if not, thank you so much, Vincent, for a fantastic talk.